Hi there. Welcome to my little mini webinar on what bullying is and what it is not. Before I get started, just a little bit of information about me. My name is Mattice, and I have been studying workplace bullying since 2004. I got interested in the topic of workplace bullying because I was the director of compliance for an organization here in San Diego where I live, and part of my responsibilities included human resources. And I found myself working with a bully. I found myself working with a real asshole, pardon my language, but that's what he was. And the guy yelled a lot. He was an uber excessive micromanager. He made life really uncomfortable for the people around him. Lots of turnover in his department. He was just a really unpleasant individual. And as the director of human resources, I experienced a lot of the organizational repercussions of his behavior. I dealt with a lot of turnover. I dealt with a lot of people crying in my office because of his behavior. I really became the buffer between him and the rest of the employees. And not to mention, I also felt bullied by this person. So I experienced it on an interpersonal level, and I experienced it from the organization's level. One of the things that was really fascinating for me in this situation was that as much as I talked to the executive director about the behavior and asked the executive director for help in putting an end to the behavior, the director wouldn't. And he would always just say things like, well, that's just how he is. I don't know why it bothers you, or, just let it go. He would always say, you have to be the bigger person. And it was always like, well, why do I have to be the bigger person? Why can't you just talk to him about his behavior? I don't understand. And so during this time, while all of this was going on, I was getting my master's degree at San Diego State, and I had a class called The Dark Side of Communication. And I had to write a paper about something dark. And so I decided to write a paper on this person that I worked with and came across the phrase workplace bullying and was absolutely fascinated by what I was reading. And I learned that the phrase workplace bullying had been in academic research for about 30 years, and that lots of other countries already had laws against workplace bullying, and that America was pretty far behind in having laws against workplace bullying. And I also learned that my president's response was pretty standard. It was pretty normal for leaders of an organization to sort of discount the kind of damage that the bully was causing. And so from there, I just found this to be really fascinating and therapeutic, actually, and have just continued to write and research and speak and publish and offer consulting services and trainings on the topic of workplace bullying. So that's a little bit about me. So I put this webinar together because there is a lot of information online about workplace bullying, and I think sometimes it's helpful to compare and contrast things in order to understand them. So I wanted to give you some information about what bullying is and give you some examples of bullying behavior. And then I'm going to talk about what bullying is not, so that there's hopefully a clearer understanding of what it is and what it isn't in the end. So jumping right in, there are three components of the definition of workplace bullying. The first component is that bullying is repeated. So bullying is about an ongoing, pervasive behavior that's happening, about once a week, and it's happening for at least a period of 6 months before it's bullying. Bullying in general tends to go on for a period of 2 to 5 years. So often people quit somewhere in that range of 2 to 5 years because they're not getting the help that they need. And this is an important piece of information regarding the definition of bullying, because a lot of times people will say, well, if John's just in a bad mood, I don't want to have a policy against that. Or if Susan yells sometimes, we're adults, we don't need to have policies around workplace bullying if that's what we're talking about. And that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about behavior that's an ongoing problem for the organization. And again, researchers who like to quantify things have come up with this number, that generally bullying is happening for a period of 6 months, and it's happening about once a week. The next component central to the definition of workplace bullying is that it creates a psychological power imbalance. So what happens is there's an initial bullying behavior where the bully in some way pushes on a target. And it might just be a simple eye roll, in a staff meeting, or maybe it's a nasty email or a snide comment, and whatever it is, and for whatever reason, in that situation, the target does not speak up for themselves. And so the bully walks away from that interaction, probably subconsciously, feeling that, hey, I've pushed on this person a little bit and they didn't respond. Interesting. I'm going to file that away. And the target walks away from that scenario, perhaps not even really noticing it or brushing it off as, just this person's maybe having a rough day, and they kind of let it go. So the bully, with this information in their head that they can push a little bit on their target, they do. They push a little bit, and for whatever reason, the target continues to not speak up, and the bully continues to push, and the target continues to not speak up. And over time, the bullying becomes more and more frequent, and it becomes more and more aggressive. And so the relationship unfolds a lot like a crescendo, where there's this, initial bullying incident, and over time, the power imbalance becomes greater and greater and greater. And eventually, the bully does come to realize, I have power over my target, and the target comes to realize, wow, this person has power over me. Now, obviously, there's power in an organization, there's hierarchy, and that's normal, and it should be there. But when the power imbalance is psychological, that's when it's dangerous. So, you could equate workplace bullying to domestic violence more so than you could equate it to something like conflict, because domestic violence, the target or the victim in that case has the same feelings that there's this psychological power imbalance. So not only does the perpetrator have physical power over their victim, but they also have psychological power, and that's why women who are victims of domestic violence don't leave. It's not that easy. There's a power imbalance there. There's a psychological hold that the perpetrator has over the victim, and it's similar in bullying at work, that there is this power that comes from the bully's ability to push down the target, and that's what makes bullying so dangerous. So the third piece, or third component of workplace bullying, is that it causes harm to targets and witnesses. So obviously, if somebody is feeling like somebody else at work has power over them, that person, that target, is going to feel anxious, they're going to be fearful, they're going to perhaps become depressed, and they're certainly going to be stressed out. It's no secret that stress causes physical problems. Stress causes, ulcers and heart problems, heart disease, headaches, stomach aches. You're not eating well, you're not sleeping well. So targets live this life of fear and anxiety and often depression. And in fact, research has absolutely found that people who feel bullied at work can ultimately develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, because of the nature of bullying, and because they feel so helpless, and because they're not getting the help that they need. Definitely reports of suicide in the adult world from bullying, just like all of the reports you hear online about suicide in teenagers and young kids who felt bullied. Adults react similarly. You just don't hear about it in the media. And the other important point is that targets, people who self-identify as someone who is bullied, absolutely experience all of these things, but so do witnesses. So even if I go to work every day and I don't feel like John picks on me, but I can see that he really goes after Sue, and it's a pretty constant thing, and that Sue's not getting help and that she's not able to stand up for herself, that's going to bother me. And I'm going to start to feel stressed out myself. I'm going to start wondering if John's going to come after me, so I'm going to start being fearful. I'm going to maybe lose sleep. I'm certainly going to lose loyalty to the managers in the organization because I can see they're not helping Sue. So, one business case for ending bullying is that it doesn't just affect the one person who feels bullied, or the two or the three or the five people who feel bullied. It affects everyone, even people who aren't necessarily feeling like they themselves are bullied. So definitions are nice, behaviors I think even better. So in reviewing all of the different surveys out there regarding workplace bullying, I started to realize that there was a pretty clear theme in all of these surveys, and that you could really categorize any of the surveys that researchers use regarding workplace bullying. You could really categorize those behaviors that they were listing in their surveys into 3 buckets. And so that's what I'm going to offer you here. So the first bucket of bullying behavior is aggressive communication. So this is behavior that you can actually see. Getting in someone's personal space, finger pointing, sending nasty emails, doing things that everybody can see. It's out in the open. That's aggressive communication. I'll give you one example. I was an expert witness on a court case against a very large retailer here in the United States, and in that scenario, the manager was really going after one particular person, and he would, it was very aggressive communication. That was the bully's MO. He was getting in his personal space. He was yelling, even to the point where the target and others were wondering if this manager had some psychological problems, because his temper just seemed to be really out of control, particularly when it came to this one target. So that was all, very aggressive communication. And in the end, one of the things the bully did was he would get really close to the target, and he'd stick his finger in the target's nose so that he could hold the target, nose to nose, and make threats to him face to face like that. Now, once there's touching, I think that crosses over into workplace violence, but the retailer didn't see it that way. The bully actually became so frustrated with the target that he ended up punching him. So those are all examples of aggressive communication, and also an example of how bullying can turn into workplace violence. The next bucket is acts aimed at humiliation. So for example, I did some training for a civilian department within the Navy recently, and that was one of their big complaints, was that managers pointed out mistakes publicly pretty constantly. And this was an interesting scenario because it was sort of like the managers are all bullies and the employees all felt bullied by the managers. So the managers had developed some sort of managerial MO that was being perceived as bullying by all of the employees. So that would be an example of acts aimed at humiliation, pointing out mistakes in public, taking minor mistakes to managers. So actually that was one of the things that was going on in my situation when I felt bullied, was that the bully would constantly report mistakes that I made to the executive director. If I was late, he would report that, and so he was sort of always keeping an eye on me, and anything I did wrong he told the executive director about. So that's an example of something aimed at humiliating me. So that's the second bucket. The third bucket is manipulation of work. Now, this is the bucket that makes bullying pretty complicated and difficult to define and difficult to see. So I'll give you some more examples. I wrote a letter on behalf of a woman who was filing a complaint with the EEOC, and even though the EEOC doesn't manage workplace bullying complaints, she was adding workplace bullying into her list of problems that she was experiencing at work. And so in that scenario, one of the problems was that this was an alcohol and beverage control office and in California, and everyone in this office had about 30 applications that they were managing at any given time. So, people submitting their liquor licenses, and you have about 30 of those that you're managing at any given time. Well, this woman was given between 60 and 80, depending on the time of year and what was happening. So everyone else around her who had her same job was given 30. She was given between 60 and 80. She was given that workload under the premise that you've been here the longest, you're a great employee, I know you can do it. So she took it on. And eventually she realized she couldn't do 60 liquor licenses at one time. It was too much work. And so she asked the manager if she could disperse some of her clients out, and the manager said no. So then she said, well, can I get some overtime? Can I come in on the weekends to keep up? The manager said no. She said, can I get a part-time assistant? The manager said no. She said, can you do some of the work? The manager said no. So the manager gave her all of this work. The employee made it very clear that she was not able to manage the workload, and the manager ignored that. So then performance evaluation time comes around, and the manager gives this employee a poor performance evaluation and says that she's a poor producer and she can't keep up with the workload. And it's like, well, that's not a secret. I've been talking to you about this all year long. But now on this woman's record is a poor performance evaluation that says she can't keep up. And so that's an example of manipulation and also an example of humiliation. You know, this woman had worked there for a really long time, and she was absolutely appalled at this employee evaluation. Another example of manipulation, I did a community workshop here in San Diego, and a woman came to me after and wanted to speak with me about her situation. And so we met for coffee. And she brought with her all of her employee evaluations that she'd had over the last 20 years. And she'd been working at a community college, and she'd had all of these wonderful employee evaluations over the course of 20 years. She'd had 5 different managers. They'd all said she was pretty good. Yeah, she had her problems. She's not perfect, but, you know, pretty good employee. She gets a new manager, her 6th manager, and in the last 2 years, this new manager had given her very poor performance evaluations. Now, if you're in HR, you're thinking, well, perhaps her performance wasn't that great, or perhaps this new manager was holding her to higher expectations. Maybe it's the employee's fault. And the point is that that may be so. You may be right. I didn't know this lady. I didn't work with her. I don't know anything about her performance. What I do know is that the content of the employee evaluation was bullying, because the employee evaluation did not say anything good, and it didn't offer any resources to resolve the bullying. So it basically just said, you stink, and I think you should be demoted. And that was the extent of her employee evaluation. It didn't say anything about what she was doing well. It didn't say anything about goals. It didn't say anything about resources she would be provided to improve. It literally just said, here's all of the problems, and I'm recommending you for a demotion. So that's manipulation, because she's leaving this employee hanging in the wind. The employee has no idea how to fix it. And again, that sort of falls under humiliation. This woman, again, had been there for a really long time, and all of a sudden she's being told she's a poor performer with no real explanation. That's bullying, because it takes a person down. It creates that psychological power imbalance. So those are some examples. So let's move into talking about what bullying is not. So bullying is not conflict, okay? And sometimes idea that bullying and but in conflict, both parties feel they have a voice and can be heard and are being heard. In bullying, it's about control and power imbalance. So one party is being heard and the other party is being shut down. And so conflict does not have that psychological power imbalance, and bullying does, and that's what makes the two different. What about a tough boss? I get this question a lot when I'm out speaking. What makes a tough boss versus a bully? And I'll tell you, there's a couple ways to look at the answer. So let me share another story with you. After I left the organization where there was a bully, I moved on into working at a startup organization, and this organization was growing pretty fast and needed HR to be put in place, and so that's what they hired me for. But it was a startup, and so I did much more than HR, as you often do in a startup. I wore, 20 different hats, and I was doing things that I didn't even know how to do and learning as I go, because that's how startups work. So everybody knew I was finishing out graduate school and that I was doing all this research on bullying, and so they would talk to me about it. And one employee, a fellow coworker, he took me to lunch one day, and he wanted to talk with me about our CEO. Rick was his name, and this employee said, well, don't you think that Rick's a bully? You're the expert, but I feel like he's a bully. I feel bullied by him. And what I realized was that bullying is very much about perception. I was really energized by the way Rick managed us. he was aggressive. He was a tough boss. He did yell sometimes in staff meetings. He could be intimidating, but I enjoyed it. I felt energized by the company. I enjoyed working there. I didn't mind putting in long hours. So I didn't see him as a bully, but here my coworker saw him that way. But then one day, because I didn't always know exactly what I was doing, it was a startup in an industry I'd never worked in before, I made a big mistake. So part of my job became some customer service stuff because, again, it's a startup, that's what you do. And I made a mistake for a customer, and it was a pretty big mistake, and the customer was pretty mad. And so Rick, the CEO, sent an email to me, and he CC'd the entire office. And the email was very scathing. It was certainly aggressive communication, and it was certainly meant to humiliate me, because he CC'd everyone. So everyone in the office knew that I'd made this horrible mistake and that Rick was mad. And so what I did was hit reply to all, because I wanted people to know that I was going to stand up for myself. I figured if I only responded to Rick and I didn't reply all, that they would all wonder if I stood up for myself, or they'd wonder if they could bully me, and I just felt like everybody needs to know my answer. He brought them in, I'll let them see my answer. So I hit reply to all, and I didn't apologize for my mistake. I didn't hide from it, but I just said, yes, I made a mistake, and here are the things that I think we could do to fix it. So here are my 5 options, and you let me know which of these things you want me to do. If you want to talk about the mistake, though, any further, we will be doing that in your office with the door closed. And I hit send. And it was like, if I get fired, I get fired. I'm not going to work in an organization where I'm treated this way. And within 30 seconds of hitting send, my boss came out of his office and he yelled across the entire office, "Way to go, Kat, I deserve that. Way to put the hammer down." And so he was, I'd earned his respect. I'd stood up for myself. And what I realized was that was my initial bullying incident, that Rick was pushing on me. And if my response had been to sort of cave in and apologize and appear wishy-washy, that he probably would have bullied me, and I would have become like my coworker. So I saw Rick as a tough boss until I made a mistake, and then I saw the potential to be bullied. I stood up for myself, and I was never treated that way again. So that's one way to look at this difference between a tough boss and a bully. Another way to look at it is intention, and I get that a lot, that it's about intention, that a tough boss, their intention, although tough, is to make you a good employee, and their intention is about the success of the organization and therefore your own success, versus a bully who intends to bring people down. I don't know if that's the right answer or not, but I think in the end it's perception. You might perceive someone to be a tough boss, and someone else might think they're a bully. The third thing that bullying is not is harassment. So harassment is illegal and bullying is legal. Harassment is about protected classes, and bullying is about equal opportunity aggression. So I want to dive into this a little bit deeper. So this is my last slide here on this webinar. Just to talk about the differences and similarities between harassment and bullying. So again, harassment is about a protected category. So Title VII is the federal law regarding harassment, and basically, according to Title VII, if someone is being harassed due to certain characteristics, then that's illegal. State laws have expanded upon that. I live in California, so we have, I think, something like 25 protected categories. So in California, if you are harassed because of your gender, your perceived gender, your gender orientation, your perceived gender orientation, your nationality, your race, your religion, your disability, your perceived disability, your age, the list goes on and on and on. If you're harassed for one of those reasons, that is illegal, and you are well within your legal rights to take action. If the bullying or the harassment is equal opportunity, and the bully goes after a variety of people in a variety of categories, then that is legal, and the person or the people who are targets of that behavior would have no legal recourse. So here's an interesting case study for you. In Wisconsin, a teacher had gone through a sex change, and so she had gone from male to female, and she was being picked on and harassed. In Wisconsin, harassment does not include gender identity. So in Wisconsin, she was being bullied because gender identity is not a protected category. In California, she would have been harassed. If that had happened in California, she would have had a legal case. Unfortunately, in the end, she ended up committing suicide because of the way she was treated. But that's an example of how complicated this can get. In terms of repetition, I said earlier that that was one of the 3 necessary components to the definition of bullying. So all of the legal definitions and academic definitions point to this fact that it's repeated behavior. I think it's important because you don't want it to be misconstrued as someone having, one bad day and or doing something once and that we are going to call them a bully. The point is to highlight that to the law to get you in trouble with the law. Now, one thing about this is, harassment, the definition is defined by the law. Bullying, I'm looking at a variety of definitions from a variety of academics and from a variety of state laws. And so it's not apples to apples. It's not one definition compared to another. It's one definition of harassment compared to a variety of definitions regarding workplace bullying. The third item is power imbalance. So the law never mentions power imbalance when it comes to harassment, but there is often a power imbalance. I mean, that's why it's damaging, is because there is a psychological power imbalance. If I'm being sexually harassed, of course I feel that there's a power imbalance, right? And in terms of bullying, a little bit different. Bullying usually includes this idea of power imbalance. And academic definitions definitely use that as a piece of the definition. And legally, the 4 states that have laws regarding workplace bullying allude to the power imbalance. So none of them necessarily say that so overtly, but it's based on the way they define bullying. Power imbalance is certainly part of it. In terms of intent, so back to that conversation, according to the law, harassment does not have to be intended. So I don't have to intend to harass you in order for you to feel harassed by me if I'm harassing you. Regarding bullying, again, it's up for discussion. So definitely there's an argument in the academic world around intent. I would say half of academics feel that bullying is intentional and half don't. I know plenty of people who've written books that claim that bullies are psychopaths and their goal is to go out for blood in the morning, and they pick people and their intent is to have those people driven out of the organization. I think that might be the case sometimes, but I don't think intent is necessarily part of the definition or necessarily something that should be always included in the definition. Certainly if you feel bullied, you probably feel like it's intentional, but it's not necessarily, and in fact the academic research doesn't necessarily support that it's intentional. The laws, though, do talk about intention. So in Nevada, where there is a law around workplace bullying, they define bullying, or part of the definition is that if the behavior intended to cause, or if the bullying causes harm or actually causes harm or is intended to cause harm. So they kind of say it doesn't matter if it's intended or not, it's still bullying. In Tennessee, where there's a law regarding workplace bullying, they don't mention intention at all. And Utah and California do talk about malice and use that word, so they're alluding to the fact that intention is part of the definition. The Healthy Workplace Bill, something that has been looked at in, I think, 27 states since 2003. It's never passed, but that definition of bullying includes the word malice and, so essentially intent. I would say in the end, it doesn't really matter if the intention is there or not. If somebody feels harmed by somebody's behavior, then it should be stopped. And I don't understand why there's such a focus on intent. Harassment doesn't require intention. I don't know why some people really fervently believe that bullying does have to include intention. I don't think it matters, but that's my 2 cents. Regarding subjectivity, the law doesn't focus on the harm, so you can't, or you can sue for harassment even if you weren't necessarily harmed by it. But so you don't have to prove harm. But with bullying, definitely the academic and legal definitions absolutely talk about harm, and that's part of the definition. And finally, something that's similar between the two, the perpetrator can be anybody. It could be a vendor, it could be a superior, it could be a subordinate, it could be a peer. So really anybody can be a perpetrator of either of these behaviors. So with that, hopefully my little discussion on what bullying is and what it is not is helpful for you. Let me know if you have any questions or need anything. My email address is Catherine@civilitypartners.com. Thanks so much.